Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 31st of August in the 35th week of 2012. For more than 20 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and when we were locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good people at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are David Green and Ron Szoke. We'll take turns suggesting an item from the week's news has been ignored or misreported, sometimes even innocently, and then giving the others a chance to comment on it. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the 20 years we've been on the air. Chomsky has said that in the American media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Today is the 31st of August. On this day in the year 1888, a woman called Mary Ann Nichols was murdered in the East End of London. She is remembered, if at all, because she was the first of the victims ascribed to a serial killer given the name Jack the Ripper. The actual circumstances surrounding Jack the Ripper are lost to history, although there are a lot of rumors about it and concerns. I mentioned these serial cases, this case of serial murder from all these years ago, because I had a discussion this last week with a correspondent who took strenuous objection to my drawing a parallel between Jack the Ripper and Barack Obama. The circumstances, as the discussion developed, the circumstances growing out of murders and the reasons for it weren't quite that my friend contended that after all, Obama's murders of men, women, and children were done from the highest motives, the extension of American imperial influence into the Southwest Asia, whereas the Jack the Ripper's murders were done from low and base motives. He was a murderer. Now, there's a further interesting complication that one of the theories about Jack the Ripper was that he was a member of the British royal family. And the reason the cases were never resolved and that nothing ever came of it was that he was protected by his position when it became clear that a member of British royalty was responsible for these murders of prostitutes in the East End of London. Now, this wasn't necessarily brought up by the adventures of a third in line to the British throne in Las Vegas last week, but the circumstances of someone in high places committing murder was the parallel that was being drawn in reference to our own maximum leader. Point here is that it can't be murder if it's Barack Obama committing the action, because of course these are done for political reasons. As the late Richard Nixon put it, if the president does it, it's not a crime. Now, I was trying to suggest there was something wrong with that, and that there was indeed a parallel to be drawn between one serial killer and another. So, you are listening to News from Neptune. It's not murder when you do it edition. And we will begin with some events of the week with Ron Szoke.
Yes, today I wanted to start with a little survey of some of the headlines I've seen over the past few weeks, perhaps 2 or 3 months. I have one going back actually to 2007. National poll, majority say the U.S. income gap is too wide. More recently, from the Associated Press, the U.S. poor are at the highest rate since the 1960s. The ranks of America's poor are on track to climb to the levels unseen in nearly half a century. Census figures for 2011 will be released this fall in 2012. in the critical weeks ahead of the November elections. The Associated Press surveyed more than a dozen economists, think tanks, and academics, both nonpartisan and those with no liberal or conservative leanings, and found a broad consensus. The official poverty rate will rise from 15.1% in 2010, climbing as high as 15.7%. Several predicted a more modest gain, but even a 0.1, that is a 1/10 percentage point increase, would put poverty at the highest level since 1965. Poverty is spreading at record levels across many groups, from underemployed workers and suburban families to the poorest poor. Next headline from May of this year. More families have no savings. Recession drained funds and boosted the debt. That's from USA Today. In July, consumer credit level in May was the highest since 2007. Experts say it's likely a temporary response to hiring rather than a sign of more confidence. This is the line, by the way, taken by the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal sometimes, that the increase in consumer debt is a sign of increasing confidence in what the economy will provide in the future. August 2012, Pew Research Center's study, the middle class slice of the U.S. income pie is the smallest in decades. Economic woes, concentration of wealth blamed for the worst decade in modern history. And then just about 2 days ago in the AP, most Americans say the rich don't pay enough taxes. The income gap is increasing between the rich and poor. A majority of Americans say the growing divide is bad for the country and believe that wealthy people are paying too little in taxes, according to a new survey. Unfortunately, Mr. Romney said nothing about this last night, and the headlines were today that he seemed to be promising us explicitly and implicitly that if he's elected, there will be plenty of jobs for everyone. And I just wonder if there's anyone who actually believes that. But what's happening since actually the mid-1970s is a vast redistribution of wealth going on in this country that most people are not aware of, what's classically called the immiseration of the middle class. Under the burden of student loan debt and medical debt, and this is appearing in various forms. The student loan debt, for example, I noticed here before, Joseph Stiglitz, USA Today in July, debt buries the American dream, more and more hopelessness among those who borrowed money to attend college after they were told that in order to get a good job, you must go to college and get that credential, and then they graduate and find that there are no jobs available. So Mr. Romney is giving us hope, apparently, that there will be jobs. Unfortunately, if any of them are available, they'll probably be minimum wage jobs at some fast food place. The reaction to this has been rather muted so far in the USA. In Canada, there's been a more boisterous response. A new notice, Montreal student strike continues after classes forced to reopen. 2 days of student protests, arrests after Bill 78 forces the students back. Student protests, this says, broke out on college campuses in Montreal for the second day in a row on Tuesday following the enforcement of a winter makeup term at all Quebec universities that were hit by student strikes earlier this year. As striking students marched through classrooms, banged on desks, and blew horns, Montreal police were called in and ultimately detained 21 protesters. So in Canada, they're not simply lying down for this. The other response has been increasing notice of what happens if you try to get some relief from this debt. Congress kept changing the law, apparently in the 1970s, when there were private insurers or loans involved. in making it impossible to discharge the student loan debt through the regular processes of bankruptcy. So, interesting article in this morning's New York Times, when the price of shedding student debt is hopelessness. This is about the total humiliation that one must submit to. It's still possible to get some student debt remitted, but you have to go into court and convince a judge that this would cause undue hardship. And one of the criteria used is the certainty of hopelessness. That is, there would be no hope whatever at any time in the future that you would ever make enough money to start paying off this debt. So if you are willing to do this, to submit that you to the judge and prove to him or her that yours is a completely hopeless case, and perhaps someone will mention, well, hey, there's the lottery. You might get some money that way. But in any case, it's become a kind of theater of the absurd. People having to go into court and try to prove to a judge that their case is completely hopeless and they will never be able to make enough money to start paying off their student loan. So if there's time later, I'll come back to some of the additional reaction to this. The rise now of more occasions of barter and of local currencies. But that's enough for now.
Thank you, Ron. You've got views on this, I believe, David?
Yeah, I've actually this sort of ties into some things I've been thinking about lately. And that has to do with the nature of poverty and how we define poverty and the meaning of poverty, which I don't think is often spoken of in quantitative terms, but isn't very often spoken of in qualitative terms. In quantitative terms, certainly a lot of data there is to show that people aren't doing very well, but in their inimitable way, people to the center and right of the political spectrum can also show in various ways that poor people have more than they used to have, namely stuff like cell phones, or B, that government transfers make poor people less poor or even not poor, or various arguments like that tend to minimize or obscure the nature of poverty. But in a qualitative sense, and the issue I'd really like to raise, and I'm glad, Ron, you brought this up, because I have been wanting to sort of raise this issue. What does it mean not to be poor, or what is it? And what I'm referring to is just the idea that people have a future. People feel like they have an economic future that will allow them to save some money, to lead a adequate lifestyle, to pay for their children's education, to retire, to enjoy some of the benefits of retirement if they might live that long and have some extra money. Just all those quality of life issues that are just completely obscured by the notion of whether someone falls marginally above or marginally below the poverty line, and whether getting the earned income tax credit might bring one marginally above that line. I'm talking about quality of life issues, and ultimately I think what you refer to there, Ron, this hopelessness, this idea, I'm referring to something the opposite of that, the idea that one is hopeful enough to get a job that will provide A, growth in that job, and B, growth in other ways.
Yeah, the thing I remember about being very poor as a child is the constant humiliation of not being able to do or to have the things that I thought everyone else did or had. And particularly, well, in my own case, being unable to afford proper dental work. That's why I have terrible teeth, crooked, and there was just no hope ever of getting proper orthodontia or anything of the kind. That was completely out of the question. And it's still bothers me occasionally, but hey, what can be done now?
The morning paper also brings the news that the president of Yale. Richard Levin is retiring after 20 years at the helm of the boys' school in New Haven, and he's retiring to more universal praise. He's been a popular president of Yale. But it did note, the article about his retirement noted almost in passing that the annual tuition to Yale these days is precisely twice what it was when he became president. Now, this is influencing people, as it were, at the other end of the social spectrum, because another thing has happened to Yale and the other Ivy League colleges in the years that he's been president. Their clientele has gotten richer and richer. It is remarkable to see from a point in roughly in the late 60s, early 70s, where the what is technically the Gini index, the measure of equality or tendencies to it amongst the students of the Ivy League colleges hit its lowest point. That is, they was most equal. It's gone straight up since then, at an increasingly unequal the students of the Ivy League colleges in comparison to the mass of humanity in the country as a whole. And this is particularly interesting because as a number of economists have pointed out, notably Doug Henwood of the Left Business Observer, there's no economic reason why higher education, not just in the Ivy League, but higher education across the board, shouldn't be free. The costs actually are very small, and we hear all this horrible talk about how strapped colleges are and so forth, and how expensive it is to do things for this generation of students, and therefore they have to pay much more. In fact, it's not true. The actual economics of higher education would not be bent out of shape if it were made free to all comers. As it was, for example, in Britain less than a generation ago, until the Labour Party came in, as a matter of fact, and as other countries manage in one way or another without the basic wealth of this country. Something else happened here with American higher education in the same period. Debt peonage. The rise in the student loan business. There are now more outstanding student loan than there is credit card debt, apparently. And this is something that really has grown up in the 20 years that Richard Levin has been president, primarily. There wasn't much student loan debt a generation ago. There is a great deal of it now. And it's been suggested this isn't just an accident. This isn't the market working in its blind, efficient fashion. No, this was a conscious move to essentially quieten the campuses. That the reason we don't have a political movement on American campuses of any significance these days, among faculty, I might say too, that's a slightly different matter, but also among students, in the way that we did a generation and more ago, is the fact that everybody's in debt up to their eyelids, and you're not gonna cause upset if it suddenly is going to put you in a position where you're not going to be able to pay those debts. And it's a conscious policy to encourage the indebtedness of American students, and it's worked pretty well. So it's it's a special case. After all, we remember only about 20% of our fellow citizens go to major colleges in this country. We've been hearing some places about what's the immense amount of money that's being spent by for-profit colleges right now, with the result of very poorly prepared people, apparently, for those jobs that a college degree is supposed to get them. So that's another dimension of the scandal. But the scandal that affects Richard Levin, Yale University, and the other premier colleges in this country is this one of consciously encouraged student debt. And I was interested to see that in the discussion of university life in the news magazines this week, the only article that touched on the matter was the New Republic. The only one that I saw that touched on the matter was the New Republic. And they wrote an article about Sex Week at Yale. and whether Yale was acting appropriately according to the sexual lives and needs of its students. No mention of tuition, no mention of debt peonage, not even any mention of the departure of Mr. Levin, except insofar as he had contributed to the health and well-being of the students at Yale in this regard. So, I don't know. Apparently, inequality will continue to support our university system in a way to which it has surely become accustomed. You're listening to News from Neptune. We have a list of things here we might talk about. David, you want to choose a new card here?
I've got one thing to put on our list here in terms of forgotten or unreported news items that Carl referred to before. And that is Mitt Romney's alleged ties in terms of raising money for Bain Capital with the leaders of Salvadoran death squads. It was reported on in the media by Amy Goodman at Democracy Now!, which of course you see every morning on UPTV. It was referred to according to my Google News search, it was referred to in a newspaper in Hawaii, by a columnist there, and nowhere else, practically nowhere else, and definitely not in the New York Times. So the question becomes, as William F. Buckley used to always say, why do we hear all kinds of negative things about Mitt Romney by New York Times columnists, about his background, about various aspects of his investment portfolio, but why do we not hear about his ties in originally raising the money for Bain Capital with leaders of Salvadoran death squads in the 1980s? And, perhaps the question answers itself, but it's interesting to me what the media is willing to report and not report, and moreover, what Obama or the Obama campaign will be willing to exploit or not exploit in their attacks on Romney. I bet that the Salvadoran death squad issue doesn't come up in this campaign, because foreign policy, by and large, is a consensus issue, even in this sort of historical sense of reminding ourselves what we were actually involved in various times. Both parties have to agree not to talk about such things, and only to talk about the relatively marginal issues, and perhaps in Obama's case, emphasize some of the populist aspects of that he will try to bring to the fore in his campaign. But even beyond the Salvadoran death squads, I will be interested to note, as the campaign unfolds from now on, exactly what Obama's tactics are, because, again, I fear that he's been given some juicy softballs to hit out of the park by various journalists. We heard Matt Taibbi of Rolling Stone interviewed the other day and writing a long article talking about what should be some pretty juicy issues for the Obama campaign to pounce upon regarding Bain Capital's looting, say, of KB Toys as part of their investment strategy. Some real good sort of Joe the plumber type person to talk about exactly what the effect of Bain Capital is. But is the Obama campaign really interested in pointing out what Bain Capital is up to, or are they interested in not exposing that some of the same types of people, of course, support the Democratic Party as support the Republican Party?
You can take on that, Ron?
Yes, well, this is another kind of submerged theme in some things I've been reading. The New York Times is often our only source for a number of these points, and yet it is itself compromised, it seems, in some cases, by its relationships with Stratfor and some say the CIA and so on. And it's also partially owned, I understand, by Carlos Slim, the immensely wealthy Mexican telephone magnate. And so I think they are inclined to tread very softly in certain areas that might be offensive to Mr. Slim and certain other tycoons of that ilk. What do you think of that?
You're seriously suggesting the New York Times is a spokesman for the capitalist class, Ron? Good heavens. When's this radicalism? It seems to me that we are actually suffering from, among other things, one of the least consequential presidential elections in decades, and not just because we happen to have these two particular clowns running against one another in the principal business parties, but because those business parties, or particularly that 1%, has got the fix in perfectly. I mean, it's controlled. It's got both sides. The reason there are no issues, none of the policy issues are on the table between the two presidential candidates, is that they're working for the same people. And so the economic and military policies that you would think would be under debate here, they essentially agree on. And so we get this sort of personality-driven election where we wonder whether Romney is nice to his dog or not, literally.
Yeah. Well, there was an enormous effort to portray Romney as such a nice guy.
Yes, exactly.
So friendly and kind and benevolent, and
his wife spoke up for him. Wasn't that nice?
Yeah, right. Well, didn't Paul Ryan's mother speak up?
Yeah, exactly.
Right,
sure.
right.
Yeah.
He's such a nice kid.
These are not the they don't want to talk about the issues at all, and that's why I just love that one moment I actually did love in this convention was a perfect Freudian return of the repressed. The repressed in this case was the Ron Paul movement, which really did want to raise economic and military issues. It really did want to be anti-Wall Street, and it really did want to be anti-war. I mean, actually, the central Ron Paul movement was. So there's an immense effort made to make sure that the Ron Paul movement moved off those issues, and indeed they found a willing surrogate for Ron Paul in his son, Rand, who said, yeah, okay, he'll talk for Ron Paul, and he promises not to mention the war or the economy. So I mean, they'd suborned the 1% had suborned the Ron Paul movement, and with a lot of other tricks, including hijacking votes. I love the business where the Ron Paul delegates were sent on a bus trip that should have taken them 20 minutes, and they arranged for the bus trip to take 2 hours, so they didn't get there in time to vote. On an issue that was particularly of particular interest to the Ron Paul campaign. So in fact, it was pretty thoroughly repressed by the Republican establishment until Clint Eastwood came on the stage, and here is what the rulers of the party were so afraid of. I wrote, some of the few sensible things said at the Republican convention came from a half-demented old actor. The poets often get there first. Apostrophizing the absent Barack Obama in theatrical style, Clint Wood said, "You thought the war in Afghanistan was okay. I mean, you thought that was something that was worth doing. We didn't check with the Russians to see how they did there for 10 years, but we did it." Now, here, the anti-war movement, such as it is in this country, has been desperately trying to say things like that since Obama got himself elected by being opposed to the war. It takes an elderly director to say that on the stage of the Republican convention. He asks, "So, Mr. President, how do you handle promises you've made?" He mentions Gitmo, of course, but particularly Obama's mendacious insistence that the U.S. was withdrawing from Afghanistan. And then he said, and I love this, "I think Mr. Romney asked the only sensible question. He says, why are you giving the date out now? Why don't you just bring them home tomorrow morning?" Now, and we were given then the wonderful picture of the Republican crowd cheering hard in the somewhat awkward fashion of applauding for immediate withdrawal of U.S. troops from the battlefield. Now that moment was not to be missed. That was wonderful. Eastwood, I think, thought he was quoting a reductio ad absurdum, which we had heard from the Romney people, if you're going to withdraw, and that is supposed to be supporting the war. But the Obama administration has been working very hard to undercut the notion that it is withdrawing, that it is continuing the war by insisting that it's withdrawing. Of course, it's all lies. But here we hear this on the stage of the Republican convention, and then from Mr. Eastwood, and then he goes on, and the second point he makes, is the point that had been surgically removed from Rand Paul. The other point that had been surgically removed from Rand Paul. Eastwood said, and I quote, "I remember 3.5 years ago when Mr. Obama won the election, and though I wasn't a big supporter, I was watching that night when he was having that thing and they were talking about hope and change. And they were talking about yes, we can, and it was dark outdoors and it was nice and people were lighting candles. I just thought this is great. I mean, everybody is crying. Oprah was crying. I was even crying. I haven't cried that hard since I found out that there's 23 million unemployed people in the country. Now that is something to cry for. That is disgrace, a national disgrace." Close quote, Clint Eastwood. Military and economic policies, the things that the two candidates are so desperately trying to avoid, except to say that whatever problems we got is the other guy's fault, here they are on the stage. I absolutely loved it, God has a sense of humor.
Yeah, well, what's that, Barack? He can't do that to himself, right?
Yeah. That was the conscious joke, and it was nowhere near so good as the unconscious one,
But I'd like to bring it back to consideration of what the Democrats, how the Democrats are, I think, going to win, and it's clear that it's obvious that what Paul Ryan and Mitt Romney say about the federal budget, about Medicare, about jobs is not true. And liberal columnists like Paul Krugman can explain very clearly why those things aren't true. And in doing so, implicitly or explicitly defend Obama's policy, Obamacare, the stimulus package, and so forth. And the question that concerns me, of course, is that, there's sort of a fulminate factor when you hear these people, when you hear Ryan and Romney and all their lies and people out of work, and you read about Bain Capital and how many people they put out of work. People, liberals, good liberals, can and should get really mad. And the question is, how is it that people are going to keep a handle on themselves and realize whether or not they choose to vote for Obama or not for tactical reasons in whatever states that might be possible, to keep a handle on it and to understand that whatever the Republicans are saying, whatever outrageous proposals they're saying, the Democrats' response to that is basically, I don't agree with that, and I'll compromise with that. And that has been the that has been at the very least what the Obama presidency has been about. Although compromise is probably too easy a word to use, because it isn't as if the goal of the Obama any less or more than any Republican president was, for example, to keep the health insurance companies in control of the healthcare system.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Well, you're, I think, being kind of old-fashioned there, David. You're assuming that people still care about whether they're being lied to or not, or whether what they're hearing is true or false. And that, I think, is more and more in question. There's this column by Jason Stanley, again, in the New York Times online. Americans no longer expect or care about candidates making honest assertions in the public sphere. The only operative criterion now seems to be whether this assertion makes me feel good about myself. And people don't care whether they're being lied to or not, and whether these assertions are false or deceptive or whatever. And I'm afraid we've reached that state where you think that people will still be offended and change their minds if they discover that something they've been told is false. And the point of Professor Stanley and a number of other people is they no longer care.
Well, let's pursue why they no longer care. I mean, it's been true for a long time that a shockingly high of our fellow citizens say, look, it's not going to make any difference to me which of these guys gets elected. Not just about this election, but about elections going back literally decades. The notion is that the fix is in, and the election is sort of a game played by pollsters and television personalities and bankers and newscasters and so forth and so on. And sometimes some odd people show up and funny things happen. But for the most part, why pay attention to it? Because it's not going to make any policy difference.
Yeah.
It's not going to make any difference in my life, say 80% of our fellow citizens, who is president next year. And it's one of the reasons people don't bother to vote. It doesn't matter, you know. Now, there are, of course, some of our fellow citizens who are quite passionate about that sort of 20% of the populace that's sometimes called the political class, as in Chris Hedges' recent book. But for these people, they're the ones that the propaganda is addressed to, that all the time and effort is spent, first of all, because they'll go to the polls, and therefore it does make a difference to Romney's people and Obama's people how they vote. But they're the ones who have to believe that there's a difference, that this is important, and whom they vote for will have some change in their lives, as it might for them, but not for many.
Well, in every election, as far as I can remember in my lifetime, there have been people touting this as the most important election in American history. It's absolutely pivotal,
Right.
and there'll be this enormous realignment, and it's absolutely crucial, and you should pay attention and vote and so on. And I wonder if anyone believes that anymore. But.
Well, there is, I mentioned before this line that you find from some American historians and political scientists about realigning elections in the society. And this comes out of the fact that the 1% is always too small a group, hence the name, to rule on its own, and it needs allies from elsewhere. It needs that political class. It needs some people who think that it does make a difference, and they need the support that comes from believing there really is something going on here in these elections. And that isn't, those coalitions are unstable. They break down because people begin to see the truth. The best example in recent history is probably 1932, when there was a realignment of class forces in the American political world, but not in the election itself. After the election, what the Democrats ran on, the platform Franklin Roosevelt ran on in 1932, had no relation to the New Deal programs that they actually followed. The reason they followed the New Deal programs is because the situation had got so bad. And there were too many Americans demanding that something be done, and what they were demanding being done was dead opposite to what the Democrats had asked for. There was another realigning election with similar results, but from very different circumstances, in 1968, when the Republicans managed to break up the Solid South on essentially as a result of the Civil Rights Movement, and we had another realignment of class forces in this country that produced the political structure that allows, in a sense, the triumph of neoliberalism, the political world we've lived in. In my more optimistic moments, I'm thinking that the 2012 election may turn out to be a realigning election too, because the Republicans under Romney will so discredit themselves that there needs to be another cover story emerge to prevent a major popular uprising demanding a change in economic and military policies. So you see, as I say, it is a burst of optimism.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that one thing you won't learn in the mainstream media is a very plain and simple fact in our current plight right now, and that is that only the government can create jobs. That is exactly, I mean, given that the accumulated wealth of business will not be spent to create jobs, only the government can create jobs to create demand, to create more jobs in the private sector. That is something that we simply cannot know. It has been a matter of American faith for hundreds of years now that our country is, it's business. It's all about business. And so the American political system and the mentality and our ability to see what's true is just stymied by this idea of these silly and sort of simplistic and dichotomous ideas about good government, bad government, what the government can do, what it can't do, and that has really impeded any sense any idea that we might move into a party system in which there would be a genuine labor party, not to mention socialist party.
Yeah, yeah. Will there be a realigning election? I doubt it. There's this. Who was the senator now who said we're running out of angry white men?
Yeah.
And the demographic trends are against the Tea Partiers and so on. And it's generally true. This class of resentful, angry white men, blue-collar men without a college degree and so on, is diminishing in numbers and importance, but they still have the command, essentially, of a whole lot of money. And the effects of that are still to be determined, I think.
But Ron, as you pointed out earlier on yourself, there are very real grievances out there under the Tea Party and these angry white men. I mean, they really have something to be angry about. Now, we may think that the sorts of things we're hearing from some of them on why they're angry, who's doing it to them, and what should be done with those people doesn't make much sense. But then again, this isn't anything new either. It was a German social democrat at the end of the 19th century who said that anti-Semitism was the socialism of fools, and what he meant was that there was a real demand for socialism in Europe at the end of the 19th century, a real understanding that people were oppressed by capitalism, but a misunderstanding about where the oppression was coming from. It was the international Jewish conspiracy, rather than the international capitalist conspiracy, that was producing the very real grievance of the time. Now look, mutatis mutandis, we got something like that going on right now, and the question asked by Noam Chomsky, among others, why isn't the left organizing this grievance rather than leaving it up to the right? And that's where the real political danger perhaps lies of a realignment in a way that we would all be distressed by.
Well, what has happened is there's been enormous success in the propaganda apparatus that is maintained essentially by the oligarchs in this country, redirecting the resentment and anger of the white working class against the undeserving poor, meaning primarily blacks, who they accuse of wanting to live on government welfare, and illegal immigrants. There's this enormous myth being circulated that these people are getting all kinds of welfare and subsidies and special privileges and exemptions. And
they're being encouraged to apply for food stamps,
for
goodness sakes.
That true, hardworking Americans are not getting. It's because of the liberals and the Democrats who are doing this to us.
You see, the problem for the American 1% is that they've got to produce a mental world of politics that allows their increasing extraction from the vast mass of the population of more and more money that is up the scale in the way that you were describing early on. To produce that vast inequality and the accelerating inequality takes a fair amount of work. People have realized that they have a right to call upon the government to fix their economic situation. That was what Franklin Roosevelt faced, a populace that was calling on the government to do something about the Depression. And what they had to do was a compromise that was pretty far from what the Democratic Party was proposing those days. Now, we're in a similar situation these days. It's a question of whether we can continue to to fool most of the people all of the time, as an Illinois politician once put it, and let people believe that indeed it is the immigrants or it's the poor and so forth who are producing the straitened economic circumstances most of us find ourselves in. If we begin to believe that those difficulties are coming from where they're actually coming from, that is the vastly inegalitarian structure of the American economy, then there will be a demand to do something about it. But it will come extra-parliamentarily, not outside of the parties, because the parties are there precisely to repress that demand.
Carl, I'm aghast. Are you suggesting class warfare?
Yeah, exactly. But it's funny about the class warfare is always an interesting charge because class warfare is not something we're in a position to start. It is the nature of the system. It is the conflict between those who have only their labor to sell, so to speak, to borrow a phrase, and those who own the means of production. That is the motive force of the system. Class warfare is there whether we like it or not, whether we recognize it or not. Still it moves, as Galileo said, and that's what we're dealing with.
Yeah. So, denouncing it or deploring it is like denouncing or deploring the tides, really, but that's another matter.
But again, that's part of the business mentality.
Sure.
That's part of that.
Well, not entirely, yeah. There's this vast difference between corporate business, I think, and small business. You see the Republicans constantly appealing to the small business person, what I would call the shopkeeper mentality. And the themes of their convention were they're stuck in the ratio algebra myth that if you work really, really hard and play by the rules and so on, you will rise socially and become prosperous and partake of the American dream. We're never told what that is exactly, but it's this great, wonderful thing out there that we're not going to describe in any detail to you.
But it's hard to believe that what the Republicans have done is gone and nominated somebody for president who's right out of the heart of that greedy vulture capitalist context, and that the Democrats aren't necessarily, except in maybe sort of soft pedal ways, critique that system and his background because it's their background too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the answer. That's right.
Yeah. So again, going back to what Carl said, what was remarkable to me is the lack of issues. There was nothing said about poverty.
Right.
Little or nothing about immigration. About the war, all we heard was strength through peace through strength.
Right. Strength through joy.
And what we're going to actually get, of course, is endless war through peace through strength. The disappearance of issues. It's amazing.
And as you say, Arbeit macht frei. It's all there. We've heard this before. There is a dog in the night aspect of this recent discussion, though, that seems to me important. I'm referring to the cliche from the Sherlock Holmes stories of, that Holmes observes that the important thing is what the dog did in the night. Watson says the dog did nothing in the night, and Holmes says, yes, that's the important thing. The dog in the night in this case is the remarkable report in the middle of July from a group that grew out of the social fora of a few years ago, a group called the Institute for Tax Justice, that published a report showing that there is about as much money hidden from the tax man as the entire GDP of Japan and the United States combined. Trillions and trillions of dollars away from the prying eyes of the tax authorities, not just the United States, although obviously, since the United States has the largest number of billionaires in the world, it is mainly here, but it also includes Europe and the UK and even Carlos Slim. But the amazing story, the quite astonishing story about the amount of money that's sheltered, and maybe even Willard has done a little of this, and that's why we don't see the tax returns. That story disappeared without a trace.
Yeah.
The story was published in the British press and elsewhere. The group that did the calculation is British, is based in London, and it was spread around the world, and not far from a 9 days wonder. It was at best a 9 hours wonder. It disappeared in, as they say, the news cycle, and no more was heard of it. Well, you know, I think this may have been the most interesting indication of what these politics are masking. When you have a situation that is this unequal, this situation that is so far removed from matching the rhetoric about work hard, do well, American dream, all this sort of stuff. When we actually hear something about the way the world economy works, it has to be suppressed. It has to disappear. It can't be part of the conversation. If someone were simply to point out, hey, a small tax on that money that's being hidden, a tiniest of tax, the money and all these stories of deficit and debt would go away.
Yes.
Would disappear like the snows of yesteryear. No, that can't be said.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, a transaction tax.
Or even, well, that's slightly different.
Would help,
Well, I was speaking of wealth tax, but even a transaction.
Yeah, that would help.
That's going far. That's at least to the point that people every now and then mention it, and that has to be put aside as saying, "Oh, well, that's not a good idea for this or that or the other." But the tax on the hidden wealth, it's not even mentioned.
Yeah.
You know, but the two would fit together very nicely. Thank you.
Yeah.
To get rid of all those things that allow people like Mr. Ryan to say, "Oh, we have to do something terrible about entitlements because we're going broke."
Yeah.
Nonsense.
Yeah.
Nonsense.
Yeah. Final thing I wanted to mention before time runs out is this business of communities getting organized and looking after themselves with local currencies and so on.
Yeah.
In Spain, this is happening. In Tom Hartman's blog, austerity ravaged Europe is breeding a ground for new experimental economies. In Spain, where recession is expected to get even worse after the government passed $80 billion worth of austerity measures, time banks are popping up that allow workers to trade in their services and hours and receive services in return, kind of backing off from the finance capital system as it has existed in Spain. There are various local experiments with doing this. You can look up on Wikipedia Ithaca Hours,
Yes.
which is called the oldest and largest local currency system in the United States that is still operating. It has inspired other similar systems in Madison, Wisconsin, Corvallis, Oregon, and a proposed system in the Lehigh Valley of Pennsylvania. And what stimulated me was hearing a piece on the radio I didn't hear all of, as something like that is being advocated for Champaign-Urbana too, called smile units or something. The problem was, of course, is that many places will not accept that kind of local currency because it's not what is called legal tender. People are not required to accept it in payment of debts and so on. But it's an interesting experiment. I don't remember much being made of it in Ithaca, New York, when I was there for a couple of years. But it's still there and still going as far as I know. There have been problems with the co-ops there and so on, cultural differences and minor local conflicts and so on. But I think this bears looking into the extent to which you can get off the grid of international finance capital, as it were, and do something locally, exchanging goods and services among local people.
Yeah, I have some friends who were involved in the Ithaca experiment from a number of years ago, and as you say, Ron, this is not something that came out of the current financial crisis or the current Great Recession. I mean, that goes back at least a generation, if not more. I mean, that was really I think in Ithaca, I think it actually began in the 60s or at least the early 70s as part of that earlier political and cultural set of innovations. So it's been around for a while, and of course in Europe it goes back to the interwar years and the independent economies that struggled to establish themselves, notably in Spain, in Catalonia, before the governments decided that the fascists should be allowed to suppress it. So, yeah, this is an important tradition, and it'll be interesting to see if something more comes from it. There are really two issues here. One, that sort of independent organization. The other, demanding that the existing economy declare its real interests rather than the fake ones of the American dream talk you were speaking of a moment ago.
It's interesting that it should arise in Spain, and the reason might have to do with the fact that, for instance, when you contrast Greece with Spain, there were problems, there were structural issues, there were governmental deficit issues and tax issues in Greece that have made it a worse case. But in Spain, had a healthy, economy until they had a housing bubble, which was completely generated, maybe not completely, but it was primarily, from what I understand, generated by outside finance. In other words, there's all this money floating around. It was funneled into Spain to inflate property values, and then ended up crashing the whole economy. So Spain, I think it would be particularly clear to the people in Spain that finance and the manner in which global finance works is part of this problem. And then you add to that the sort of historical background that Carl referred to during the 1930s, and I'm not sure what the relationship to that is, of something called the Mondragon, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, probably not, movement, sort of cooperative economic movement that has, I think, survived in Spain in various ways. So there's a kind of a fertile soil for something like this to happen in Spain. And
the even more serious circumstances of Greece right now, apparently both trends are visible too. There are local economies of the sort that Ron was talking about springing up in Greece, and at the same time vicious anti-immigrant riots by those who have been told by fascist parties straight out that the immigrants were the ones who were causing them their problems. There are real problems, and there needs to be an explanation of where the problems are coming from and what's to be done about it, and the jury is out on it. We saw this, this was Europe in the 30s. And the extent to which the current situation resembles that, is definitely disturbing.
Somewhere far in the background of this, of course, there are these old traditions of anarchism and syndicalism in Spain, too, that may have some role in this today. But
yeah,
I'm not really up on that.
If there were time, I wanted to talk a little about how the word anarchist was rattled around this week's news. Everything from soldiers apparently committing murder to prevent plots emerging, to grand juries going after anarchists who broke windows at Wells Fargo in Seattle. So, yeah, anarchism is on the agenda, Ron. I think perhaps, once again, the return of the repressed has turned out to be our theme today. You've been watching News from Neptune for August 31st and the 35th week of 2012. Our program is named in honor of Noam Chomsky. This has been the It's Not Murder When You Do It edition, although I think, as I say, there's another theme that's emerged. If our program interested you, you might want to look for similar programs here on Urbana Public Television, particularly the special 2-hour edition of Democracy Now! Every weekday morning during the upcoming Democratic Convention. The Big Picture, the Thom Hartmann show that Ron referred to, will air at 5 p.m. daily during that week. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight on News from Neptune have been David Green and Ron Szoke. This and other editions of this program will be seen on the website newsfromneptune.com and on Facebook. I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com and on Facebook, and I'm happy to receive your comments. Our thanks to UPTV, especially Jake, Jason, and Caleb. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come, and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.